Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Eruvin. We are up to Perik Yud, Mishnah Yud Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbai ben Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. The Mishnah presents another rabbinic prohibition that does not apply in the Bet Mikdash, in the temple. It involves the door of a closet or other freestanding structure that is held in place with two pegs, one attached to the bottom of the door and one attached to the top. These pegs fit into corresponding holes in the closet itself, above and below the door. The pegs swivel in their holes, allowing the door to swing open and closed. The Mishnah discusses whether a peg that came out of its hole may be put back on Shabbat. Machzirin tzir atachton b'mikdash v'lo b'midinot. The Mishnah says we may put the bottom peg of a closet door back into its hole in the temple, but not in the rest of the country, meaning outside the temple. And the commentators explain if the bottom peg comes out of the hole, but the top peg remains in place, the door will not fall down completely, and putting it back in place is quite easy. Therefore, this is not biblically forbidden under the melacha of building. It is prohibited only by rabbinic decree and is therefore permitted in the Bet Mikdash, in the temple. Now, the rabbis decreed that one may not put the bottom peg back in place because they were concerned that instead of inserting it gently, one might hammer it in firmly, which would violate the melacha of striking the final blow. However, like the Mishnah says, it is permitted in the temple. Now, the commentators explain the Mishnah refers to a closet that serves as a sacrificially related purpose. So, for example, it contains salt or incense. Now, since the closet is needed for the temple service, the rabbis did not forbid repairing it on Shabbat. The Mishnah continues, "Va'elyon kan v'chan asur." However, it is forbidden to put back the upper peg both here in the temple and here outside the temple. If the upper peg comes out of its hole, the door will fall down. Since in this case, putting the peg back in its hole reattaches the door, it is a biblical melacha which is forbidden even in the temple. Now, Rashi explains this Tana holds that the biblical melacha building applies even to utensils, meaning even to freestanding structures. Now, Rabbi Yehuda rules more leniently in both cases. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Ha'elyon b'mikdash," the upper peg may be put back in its hole in the temple, but not elsewhere. Now, although the door is thereby reattached, Rabbi Yehuda says this is not biblically forbidden because the melacha of building does not apply to freestanding structures such as a closet. Nevertheless, it is forbidden by rabbinic decree, and therefore it's permitted only in the temple. V'tachton b'midina, and the lower peg may be put back in its hole even in the rest of the country, because this is permitted even according to rabbinic law. And the commentators explain Rabbi Yehuda and the Tana Kama disagree on 2 points. A, the Tana Kama rules that the melacha of building includes freestanding structures, while Rabbi Yehuda limits it to structures attached to the ground. And B, the Tana Kama holds that the rabbis decreed against reinserting the lower peg, whereas Rabbi Yehuda maintains that they did not. And the Rab does tell us, Ve'en halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. And that is the end of Mishnah Yud Bet. Mishnah Yud Gimel lists 3 more activities that were permitted only in the temple. Machazirin Ritiyah b'Mikdash. We may put a dressing back onto a wound in the Mikdash, avalo b'Medina, but not in the rest of the country. And the commentators explain it is rabbinically forbidden to apply a bandage smeared with ointment to a wound, because one might smooth out the ointment, which is biblically forbidden under the melacha of smoothing. Nevertheless, a Kohen who had removed the dressing from his hand in order to perform the temple service is allowed to put it back on his hand. And the Rav explains a Kohen who has to hold something as part of the temple service, such as the bowl in which the blood of an offering is collected, must hold it directly with his hand. If anything comes between the skin of his hand and the object, the service is invalid. Therefore, a Kohen who has a bandage on his hand must remove it before serving. The rabbis were concerned that if the Kohen knows that after removing the bandage and performing the service, he is forbidden to put it back on Shabbat, he might refuse to take it off in the first place and he will not perform the service. So to prevent this, the rabbis allowed the Kohen to put the bandage back on after the service. Now, even though putting the bandage back on does not contribute to the temple service directly, the rabbis permitted it so that the Kohen will not refrain from serving. But if instead of putting it back, one wants to put the dressing on the wound for the first time, the Mishnah says it is forbidden both in the temple and outside the temple. Now, the Rav explains in this case, where the Kohen was not wearing a bandage before Shabbat, putting one on during Shabbat does not serve any temple-related purpose. It is merely for the Kohen's own needs, and therefore it is forbidden even in the temple. The Mishnah continues, Koshrin nima b'mikdash, we may tie the snap string of a musical instrument in the temple, avalo b'medina, but not in the rest of the country. Now, it is rabbinically forbidden to tie the two ends of the snap string together on Shabbat, even with a temporary knot, because one might come to make a permanent knot, which is biblically forbidden under the melacha of tying. Nevertheless, if the string of a musical instrument that is used in the temple snapped, one may tie the two ends together with a temporary knot so that it can be played during the temple service. And the commentaries explain, when the wine was poured on the altar during the service of the Tamid offering, the Leviim sang and played musical instruments. If a string of one of the musical instruments broke on Shabbat, it may be repaired by tying the broken ends together with a temporary knot, since the repair is needed for the sacrificial service. But the Mishnah says, if instead of repairing a broken string, one wants to attach a string to the instrument for the first time, it is forbidden both in the temple and outside the temple. Now, if the string was never on the instrument, it may not be put onto the instrument for the first time, even in the temple. Unlike tying together two ends of a snap string, putting a new string on an instrument is biblically forbidden. And the Mishnah continues now with the third case involving removing a wart from an animal. Chotchin yabered b'mikdash. We may cut off a wart by hand from an animal in the mikdash, avalo b'medina, but not in the rest of the country. And the commentaries explain it is rabbinically forbidden to remove a wart by hand, because one might come to do so with a tool, a knife, let's say, which is biblically prohibited under the melacha of shearing. And the Rav explains the normal way to cut a wart is to cut it off with a knife or similar tool. Therefore, removing a wart by hand is not prohibited according to biblical law, since that is not the way in which the act is usually performed. However, it is forbidden by rabbinic decree. Nevertheless, the Mishnah teaches us it is permitted to remove a wart from an animal so that it can be brought as an offering in the temple. Now, an animal that has a blemish is unfit to be an offering, and the Torah in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 22, pasuk 22, lists a wart among the disqualifying blemishes. So you are allowed to cut off a wart by hand from an animal in the temple so that it can be brought as an offering. But if instead of removing it by hand, one wishes to cut off with a tool, it is forbidden both in the temple and outside the temple, because cutting off a wart with a tool is a biblical transgression. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.